Janet wanted to observe her child's uncle when he thought he was alone, as she had been noticing her daughter crying and her mouth often seemed bitter. She decided to take a bold step. Instead of leaving for work, she pretended to head out as usual but quietly returned home, hiding behind the kitchen door. Janet's heart raced as she watched. At first, everything seemed normal. Uncle George played with Precious, feeding her and making funny faces, but then his demeanor shifted. It started from here. Janet was a young woman who loved life. She had a talent for cooking, which she turned into a thriving catering business. Her hard work paid off, and her life seemed perfect when she married Peter, the love of her life. Together, they built a cozy home filled with warmth and laughter. The greatest joy of their life was their baby girl, Precious. Her giggles lit up their days, and her tiny hands always found a way to hold their hearts. Janet adored her, showering her with love and dreams for her future. But life had its challenges. Peter, being a dedicated worker, was transferred to another city for a big project. This meant he couldn't be home as often as before. Janet was proud of him, but she worried about managing their busy lives without him. Her catering business needed her full attention, and raising Precious alone seemed overwhelming. Peter suggested a solution. "My younger brother Uncle George can help," he said one evening. "We can trust him." Uncle George moved in, and a week later he was charming, attentive, and always eager to lend a hand. Janet felt relieved. She believed Uncle George was the answer to her prayers, a kind uncle who would help care for her daughter. Little did Janet know that the decision to trust Uncle George would lead to heartbreak. With Peter working in another city, Uncle George quickly became an essential part of Janet's daily life. He handled errands, tidied the house, and most importantly, looked after little Precious. His natural charm and cheerful attitude made him seem like the perfect caregiver. "I can't thank you enough," Janet said one morning as she rushed out the door for a catering event. "I don't know what I would do without you." "Don't worry about a thing," Uncle George replied with a smile. "Precious is like my own daughter. I'll take care of her." Uncle George was always ready to lend a hand, whether it was preparing Precious's meals or rocking her to sleep. Janet trusted him completely. At first, everything seemed fine. Precious was her usual bubbly self, and Janet felt relieved that she could balance work and motherhood with Uncle George's help. But soon, subtle changes in Precious's behavior began to surface. She became unusually clingy, refusing to let go of Janet whenever she came home. Sometimes Precious would cry uncontrollably at night, her little body trembling as if from an unseen fear. Janet brushed it off as a phase. Maybe she's just missing her father, she thought. After all, Uncle George was always so patient and kind, how could she suspect him of anything? However, there were moments when Janet felt a flicker of doubt. Once, she noticed a small bruise on Precious's arm. "She must have bumped into something while playing," Uncle George explained casually. Janet wanted to believe him. What she didn't know was that her trust was being horribly betrayed beneath Uncle George's friendly demeanor. A dark secret awaited to shatter Janet's world. Life carried on as usual, but Janet couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. Precious's once bright and playful demeanor had dimmed. She clung to Janet desperately whenever she returned home from work, as if she were scared to be apart. One evening, while Janet was bathing Precious, she noticed more bruises, small purple marks on her arms and legs. Alarmed, she asked, "Did you fall, my baby? Did something hurt you?" Precious, too young to explain, simply whimpered and buried her face in Janet's shoulder. Concerned, Janet approached Uncle George later that evening. "Have you noticed these bruises on Precious? She's been acting strange lately," she said, her voice laced with worry. Uncle George laughed nervously. "Oh, kids are always getting into little accidents, aren't they? She probably bumped into something while crawling around." His tone was casual, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. Janet hesitated but decided to let it go. After all, Uncle George had been so helpful and caring, maybe she was overthinking things. But the signs continued. Precious became more withdrawn, and her cries at night grew louder and more frequent. She would wake up in terror, her tiny body shaking as Janet held her close. Janet's instinct screamed that something was wrong, but she silenced them with rationalizations. "It's just teething pains," she told herself, "or maybe she's upset because Peter is away." Deep down, Janet felt a growing sense of dread. She began to watch Uncle George more closely, though she couldn't quite pinpoint why. Little did she know, the storm was about to break, and the truth would be more horrifying than anything she could imagine. Janet's worry for Precious grew stronger each day. Her once happy baby now seemed distant and frightened, her giggles replaced by quiet whimpers. Janet couldn't help but notice the way Precious tensed up whenever Uncle George came near her. One day, as Janet prepared to leave for work, Precious clung to her dress, crying uncontrollably. It was unusual even for her recent behavior. Janet knelt down, trying to comfort her. "Mama has to go to work, my love. Uncle George will take care of you." But Precious's cries only grew louder, and she shook her little head, gripping Janet's dress tighter. Janet's heart ached. Something about this moment felt deeply wrong. "Uncle George," she called out, her voice shaky. "Come here, please." Uncle George walked into the room, his usual smile plastered across his face. "What's the matter?" he asked casually, picking up Precious. As soon as he touched her, Precious let out a piercing scream. Janet froze. It wasn't a cry of hunger or tiredness, it was a scream of fear. A cold chill ran down her spine as she watched Uncle George struggle to calm her. "I don't know what's gotten into her," Uncle George said with a nervous laugh, handing the baby back to Janet. "Maybe she's just cranky today." Janet nodded absent-mindedly, but her mind was racing. She decided to trust her gut. The next morning, she canceled her work appointments and stayed home, watching quietly from the shadows as Uncle George interacted with Precious. What she saw confirmed her worst fears. Uncle George's behavior, though subtle, was unloving. He was rougher with Precious than Janet had realized, and the way he held her made Janet's stomach churn. Janet knew she could no longer ignore the signs. It was time to act. Janet couldn't shake the unease in her heart. The next day, she decided to take a bold step. Instead of leaving for work, she pretended to head out as usual but quietly returned home. She wanted to observe Uncle George when he thought he was alone with Precious. Hiding behind the slightly ajar kitchen door, Janet's heart raced as she watched. At first, everything seemed normal. Uncle George played with Precious, feeding her and making funny faces. But then his demeanor shifted, his tone grew impatient when Precious wouldn't stop crying. Then he grabbed her arm more forcefully than necessary. Janet's blood ran cold. She felt a surge of anger but held herself back, knowing she needed more information before confronting him. She took out her phone and discreetly began recording. Later that night, her fears were tragically confirmed. When Precious fell ill, she had a fever and cried incessantly, clutching her stomach. Janet rushed her to the hospital, desperate for answers. After hours of waiting and tests, the doctor came back with devastating news. "Mrs. Peter," he began gently, "your daughter has chlamydia. This suggests sexual abuse." Janet's world shattered in that moment, her knees buckled, and tears streamed down her face as she struggled to process the doctor's words. "How could this happen?" she whispered, clutching Precious tightly. Her mind raced back to Uncle George, all the signs, the bruises, the fear in Precious's eyes. It all made sense now. Janet felt a wave of fury and heartbreak. She knew what she had to do. That night, she confronted Uncle George with her findings, holding up the recording and the doctor's report. "How could you?" she screamed, her voice shaking with anger and pain. Uncle George's face went pale, but Janet wasn't going to let him escape accountability. Janet's hands trembled as she faced him in the dimly lit living room, the weight of the doctor's report and the evidence she had gathered crushing her. But her resolve was stronger than ever. Precious, sleeping restlessly in her crib, was her reason to fight. "I trusted you with my daughter. How could you betray us like this?" Janet threw the doctor's report onto the table, her eyes blazing with fury. Uncle George glanced at the report, then at Janet, his face pale. "I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, his usual charm replaced by panic. "Don't you dare lie to me," Janet shouted, her voice cracking. She pulled out her phone and showed him the recordings. They didn't capture the full extent of his abuse, but they were enough, his rough handling and the moments that hinted at something darker. "Explain this." Uncle George's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape. "It's not what it looks like," he muttered, his voice shaking. "I would never hurt Precious." "You already have," Janet said, her voice breaking. "She's sick because of you," the doctor confirmed it. "Do you think I'm going to let this go?" The walls seemed to close in on Uncle George as Janet advanced toward him. You were supposed to be her uncle, her protector. Instead, you've done the unthinkable. You've stolen her innocence. Uncle George dropped to his knees, tears streaming down his face. Janet, please. I didn't mean to. Enough. Janet roared. You're going to pay for this, I'll make sure of it. Janet's anger turned into action. She picked up her phone and called Peter. Come home now, she said, her voice steady. We need to talk. Your brother has crossed a line. Peter rushed home the moment he heard Janet's voice. He knew something was wrong. Her tone was sharp, almost unrecognizable. As he stepped into the house, he found Janet pacing the living room, her face tear-streaked but determined. Uncle George sat slumped on the couch, his head in his hands. What's going on? Peter asked, his voice filled with worry. Janet turned to him, clutching the doctor's report. Your brother has been abusing our daughter, she said, her voice cracking with a mix of fury and grief. She handed him the report and played the video she had recorded. Peter's eyes widened as he watched, his hands trembling. No, this can't be true, he muttered, shaking his head. He looked at Uncle George, disbelief etched on his face. Tell me she's lying. Tell me this isn't real. Uncle George didn't meet his gaze. I didn't mean to hurt her, he whispered. It just happened. Peter's breath caught in his throat. His younger brother, the one he had trusted so deeply, had committed the unthinkable. Torn between loyalty to his family and the need to protect his wife and child, Peter felt as if the ground had been ripped from under him. Janet stepped forward, her voice firm. There's no excuse for what he's done. Precious is your daughter. She needs us to protect her. Peter nodded slowly, his eyes filling with tears. I don't know how to handle this, he admitted. You handle it by choosing your daughter, Janet said fiercely. Uncle George needs to face justice. We can't let this go. Peter looked at Uncle George, his face hardening. You've destroyed this family, he said. And now you'll face the consequences. That night, Peter made the hardest decision of his life. He called the authorities. The sound of sirens echoed in the distance as Janet held Precious tightly, her tears falling silently onto her baby's soft cheeks. Peter stood by the window, his expression unreadable, his phone still in his hand. Uncle George sat frozen on the couch, his head buried in his hands. You called the police, Uncle George whispered, looking up at his brother with pleading eyes. Peter's voice was heavy with anger and sorrow. You left me no choice, Uncle George. What you've done is unforgivable. I have to protect my family. Moments later, 2 officers knocked on the door. Janet took a deep breath and opened it, her resolve steady. He's the one, she said, pointing at Uncle George. The officers approached Uncle George, who stood shakily. Please, he begged, his voice cracking. It was a mistake. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Janet stepped forward, her voice trembling but strong. You didn't mean to hurt her. She's a baby. You've robbed her of her innocence and scared her for life. You don't deserve our pity. The officers cuffed Uncle George, reading him his rights as they led him to their car. Peter turned away, unable to watch, his heart torn apart. He had lost his brother and was struggling to make peace with what he had done. As the car pulled away, Janet turned to Peter. This isn't the end, she said softly, holding Precious close. But it's a start. We need to focus on healing now, for her and for us. Peter nodded, his face etched with pain. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right, he promised. That night, the house was heavy with silence, but beneath the sorrow was a flicker of hope. Justice was in motion, and they would rebuild from here. The days following Uncle George's arrest were some of the hardest of Janet and Peter's lives. Janet had always known that their lives would change the moment she confronted Uncle George, but she hadn't been prepared for the emotional toll it would take. Each time she looked at Precious, she saw the shadows of the pain she had suffered, and it tore at her heart. Peter was a shell of the man he once was, his mind consumed with guilt, questioning his judgment and wondering how he had missed the signs. How had his brother, his own flesh and blood, betrayed him in the worst possible way? One afternoon, as they sat together in the living room, Peter finally broke the silence. Janet, I should have known. I should have done something sooner. I was so blind. Janet placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes filled with compassion. You couldn't have known. You trusted him, and you wanted to believe the best in him. We all did. But now all we can do is focus on getting Precious the help she needs. Peter nodded, though the guilt still lingered in his eyes. He had been the protector, the father, and yet he had failed to protect his own daughter. The weight of that failure was suffocating. That night, Janet took Precious to a child therapist who specialized in trauma. The therapist was gentle, working with Precious through play therapy, giving her a safe space to express her feelings. Precious was still too young to fully understand what had happened, but the sessions helped her begin the process of healing. Peter stood at the door, watching through the small window as Precious played, tears streaming down his cheek. He knew it would take time, but he vowed to make things right. He would be there for Precious every step of the way. As the weeks passed, Uncle George's trial loomed. Janet was determined to face it head-on, but she wasn't prepared for the cruelty that some people would show. There were those who tried to defend Uncle George, claiming he was a victim of circumstances, that he had been misunderstood. But Janet knew the truth, and she wasn't going to let it be buried under a veil of lies. The day of the trial arrived, and Janet felt a mixture of anxiety and determination. She had never imagined herself standing in a courtroom, fighting for justice for her daughter, but here she was, ready to face Uncle George and his defense. Peter stood beside her, his face pale but resolute. They both knew this was the moment that could either heal the wounds of the past or deepen them forever. The courtroom was filled with tension as Uncle George sat on the other side, his family members by his side. The once confident and charming man seemed a shadow of himself, his face gaunt, his hands trembling. Janet's heart was heavy as she saw the man who had once been part of their family. Janet took the stand, her voice unwavering as she recounted the abuse, the signs she had ignored, and the devastation she had felt when she learned the truth. She spoke of Precious's pain, the doctor's report, and the video evidence that had exposed Uncle George's betrayal. As she spoke, she could feel the weight of every word. It wasn't just about Uncle George anymore. It was about protecting every child who had ever suffered in silence, about giving a voice to those who couldn't speak for themselves. Uncle George's lawyer tried to spin a story of misunderstanding, suggesting that the situation had been blown out of proportion, that Uncle George had never meant to harm Precious. But Janet could see through the lies. She knew what had happened, and she wasn't going to let them cover it up. Peter had a difficult choice to make. He could stand by his brother and let the lie continue, or he could support his wife and daughter, regardless of the pain it caused. He took a deep breath and stood up beside Janet. "I support my wife," he said firmly, looking at the judge. "And I support my daughter. What my brother did was wrong, and he must face the consequences." The room fell silent. After hours of testimony, the judge announced that the verdict would come the following day. As they left the courtroom, Peter turned to Janet. "We did the right thing," he said quietly. Janet nodded, her heart still heavy but hopeful. "We did," she whispered. "Now we wait for justice." The next few days felt like an eternity. Every sound seemed to echo through the walls of their home as they waited for the verdict. The once vibrant house now felt hollow, the silence was unbearable at times. Janet spent hours with Precious, trying to keep her occupied, but there were moments when she couldn't shake the thought of what her daughter had endured. Peter, on the other hand, buried himself in his work, unable to escape the guilt that haunted him. He had once believed his brother could do no wrong, but now the betrayal weighed heavily on him. At night, when they were alone, he would sit by the window, staring into the dark, thinking about how different things had been before. Janet was determined not to let this situation define her family. She threw herself into caring for Precious, keeping a close eye on her progress. The therapy sessions were helping, and she could see that Precious was starting to smile again, though it was still a tentative thing. Slowly but surely, she was healing, though it would take time. Finally, the day of the verdict arrived. Janet stood beside Peter, holding Precious in her arms, her heart pounding in her chest. They had been through so much already, and now it was time to face the consequences of what had happened. The courtroom was tense when they entered. Uncle George was already there, his face drawn, his family in tow. He looked like a man who knew his fate, and his eyes met Peter's for the briefest moment. It was a look filled with regret, but there was no turning back now. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. After what felt like an eternity, the verdict was read. "Guilty," the judge declared. "The defendant, Uncle George, is hereby convicted of child abuse. He will be sentenced to serve time in prison and will be required to undergo counseling for his actions." Janet closed her eyes, feeling a rush of relief wash over her. The pain hadn't been erased, but justice had been served. Uncle George would face the consequences of his actions, and hopefully that would be the beginning of healing for Precious. As they left the courtroom, Peter placed his arm around Janet. "We did it," he whispered. "We got justice for our daughter." Janet looked down at Precious, her heart swelling with love. "It's not over," she said softly, "but we are one step closer to rebuilding our family." In the weeks that followed Uncle George's conviction, life slowly began to find a new rhythm for Janet, Peter, and Precious. Though justice had been served, the emotional scars remained a reminder of everything they had endured. Janet had never imagined that her life would take such a turn, but in a way, it was a blessing. Through the pain, she had discovered a strength she never knew she had. She was more determined than ever to protect Precious, to nurture her through the aftermath of this traumatic experience. The days were filled with therapy sessions for Precious, along with moments of laughter and play. Precious was starting to bloom again, her laughter returning to the house like a sweet melody. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Peter was beginning to heal, though it was a slower process. He had felt as though he had failed his family, and that guilt weighed on him every day. But as he watched Janet care for Precious with such devotion, he saw the power of resilience and love. He knew that together, they could overcome anything. One afternoon, as Peter returned from work, he found Janet and Precious sitting outside, enjoying the warm sun. Precious was happily playing with her toys while Janet watched, a contented smile on her face. Peter stood in the doorway, taking in the sight of his family. "I never thought we'd get here," he said quietly, walking over to sit next to Janet. Janet looked up at him, her eyes soft. "We are still a work in progress," she replied, "but we're getting there." Precious turned to look at her parents, smiling a wide, innocent grin. "Mama, Papa," she said, reaching her arms out for them. Janet's heart swelled as she took Precious into her arms. "We are going to be okay," she said softly, holding her daughter close. Peter nodded, his heart filled with gratitude. "Yes, we will." Though they couldn't undo the past, Janet and Peter were committed to creating a future where their family was safe, strong, and whole again. Every day was a step toward healing, and they would walk that path together, no matter how long it took. The days turned into weeks, and with each passing day, the house began to feel more like a home again. The darkness of the past seemed to be receding, replaced by the small everyday joys that had once felt so ordinary. Precious's laughter was louder, her steps more confident as she grew. Janet couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for each new milestone. One afternoon, Janet stood in the kitchen, preparing a meal for her family. The scent of freshly baked bread filled the house, a small but significant sign of normalcy. Peter was sitting in the living room, reading through some work documents, but his mind seemed distant. Janet could sense the weight he carried, even though he tried his best to hide it. She turned to him, wiping her hands on her apron. "Peter, I've been thinking," she said softly. He looked up from his papers, his eyes tired but curious. "What about? I think it's time we start doing more for ourselves, for you, for us." Peter frowned, unsure of what she meant. "What do you mean?" Janet walked over to him, sitting beside him on the couch. "I know you've been carrying a lot of guilt about Uncle George, about everything. But we can't keep letting the past control us. It's time to start looking forward, to start living for today and the future, not just the mistakes of the past." Peter met her gaze, and for the first time in a long time, he nodded. "I've been so focused on what went wrong that I've been blind to what's going right. We've got a beautiful daughter, and we are stronger than ever. It's time I see that." Janet smiled, her heart light. "Exactly. We've been through so much, but we are still standing, and that's something to be proud of." Later that week, they made plans to take Precious to the park. The family outing was simple but filled with meaning, a chance to reconnect, to create happy memories that would outweigh the burdens of pain and betrayal. As they walked through the park hand in hand, Janet couldn't help but notice how much more at peace Peter seemed. He smiled and laughed, his joy evident as he watched Precious chase after butterflies, her little giggles filling the air. "Look at her," Janet said, watching their daughter. "She's so full of life. We've done good. We are doing good." Peter squeezed her hand, his heart swelling with pride. "Yeah, we are." In that moment, Janet realized something. No matter how difficult their journey had been, they were learning to heal, to find hope again. And in that hope, they had found each other once more. Months had passed since the trial, and life for Janet, Peter, and Precious had settled into a rhythm. The scars from the past still lingered, but they no longer defined them. They had found a way to rebuild, not just their home but their bond as a family. It wasn't always easy, but it was worth it. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the house, Peter came home with a surprise. He walked through the door with a wide smile, holding a small box in his hand. "What's this?" Janet asked, her curiosity piqued as she set down the dish she was preparing. Peter smiled and handed her the box. "Open it." Janet carefully peeled back the wrapping and opened the box. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet engraved with the words, "Strength, Love, Family." Janet's eyes filled with tears as she read the words, knowing that Peter had carefully chosen them for a reason. "This is beautiful, Peter," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But why?" Peter sat beside her, taking her hand. "I've been thinking a lot. We've been through so much, more than anyone should have to face. But we've come out the other side stronger, together." He paused, his eyes locking with hers. "You've held this family together, Janet. You've shown me what it means to love unconditionally, even when it's hard. This is for you so you'll always remember how far we've come." Janet looked down at the bracelet, a symbol of their journey, their pain, and their healing. She couldn't hold back the tears any longer. "Thank you," she whispered, her heart full of gratitude. "This means more than you know." Peter gently wiped away her tears. "We've come a long way, but we're just getting started. Our family is stronger than ever." As Janet slipped the bracelet on her wrist, Precious toddled over to them, her small hands reaching out. "Mama, Papa," she called with a smile, and Janet's heart melted. They both knelt down to embrace their daughter, holding her close. In that moment, Janet felt an overwhelming sense of peace. They had been through hell, but they were still standing. "We've survived, we are a family again," Janet said, her voice filled with quiet strength. "We have," Peter agreed, kissing the top of Precious's head. "And we always will." As the evening settled in, the family sat together, eating dinner and laughing. The world outside may have been unpredictable, but inside their home, there was a sense of security, a sense of belonging. Together, they were unstoppable. Together, they would continue to heal, to rebuild, and to thrive. It had been nearly a year since that dark day in the courtroom, and the family had transformed. Janet could never have imagined the pain had not disappeared entirely, but they had learned to live with it, to use it as a foundation for their growth. Every challenge had brought them closer, strengthening their resolve to protect one another. Precious was growing into a confident, curious little girl. Her laughter had become a constant in the house, and her innocent questions often brought a smile to both her parents' faces. She had a sparkle in her eyes that made the world seem full of endless possibilities. One afternoon, Janet and Peter sat on the porch, watching Precious chase after a butterfly. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the yard, and for the first time in a long while, they both felt completely at peace. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" Peter asked, his voice soft as he gazed at Precious. Janet smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Every day. It feels like a dream sometimes, a beautiful dream that we've worked so hard to make a reality." Peter's gaze was thoughtful. "I never thought I could fill this hole again, but now I don't know what I would do without you, without our family." Janet's heart swelled with love. "We've been through the fire, Peter, but look at us now. We are stronger than we've ever been." Just then, Precious turned around and ran toward them, her little feet kicking up dust. "Mama, Papa," she called, giggling. The couple laughed and opened their arms to her. She jumped into Janet's lap, and Peter wrapped his arms around them both. "I love you, Mama. I love you, Papa," Precious said, her words simple but filled with a depth of emotion that melted their hearts. "We love you too, baby," Janet whispered, kissing her forehead. Peter looked at his wife, his eyes filled with quiet admiration. "We've come through so much," he said softly, "but this is our future. This is our life now." Janet nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "And I wouldn't change a thing. We are stronger together, Peter. Our family is our greatest blessing." The evening passed in peaceful silence as they sat together, savoring the moment. They had learned many things on their journey, how to forgive, how to rebuild, and most importantly, how to love with everything they had. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Janet knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Their family had endured the worst, and now they were ready for the best. The future was bright, and it was theirs to embrace.